Hi, this is Len Edgerly. Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles. I am recording this show in Ocean Park, Maine, southern Maine, just south of Portland, and today is March 20th, 2020, and this is the 607th episode of the Kindle Chronicles. For this week's show, I have an interview with an author who is also a rap artist, a hip-hop star in Sweden, and he's written a book which was published on March 1st by Amazon Crossing. He wrote it originally in Swedish, and this is a translation into English that Amazon Crossing has brought out, and that's how I got a hold of it. I had actually approached the Amazon publishing people to do an interview with the author and the translator of The Photographer, a novel that I read and admired recently. That didn't seem like it was going to be able to work out on short notice, so they offered Jason as an alternative. And I jumped at it because it just sounded like a terrific story. His name is Jason Diakité, and he goes by Timbuktu for his hip-hop music. And the title of the book is A Drop of Midnight, a Memoir. It explores the questions of identity that Jason wrestled with as the son of a white mother and a black father, as well as his roots in America and Sweden. His parents moved to Sweden from the U.S. before Jason was born. So he was born in Sweden and has grown up there, and he's now 45, and he started work on this book about 5 years ago, as you'll hear. I connected by Skype with Jason this week in Stockholm, and here's our conversation, which began at 4 p.m. Eastern Time here in Maine, and that was 9 p.m. in Sweden. To start in, I was thinking you started working on your memoir, it looks like in 2015, and that you started out with the question of why did your parents go to Sweden and end up in Sweden at the time of your birth? And you were around 40 then. If someone had asked you that question 5 years ago and said, why did your parents come to Sweden? And with the result that you were born in Sweden and you're from Sweden, would your answer then have been different now after you went through this really big project of exploring your history and trying to answer that question, that you come up with sort of a radically different understanding of why they ended up in Sweden?
It's a great question, Len. The official, the narrative or the story that I've always been told was that, my father wanted to get a university education and couldn't afford one, but through some twists of fate, learned that he could get a university education in Sweden. He convinced my mom to come along with him, and they basically just got stuck here. So that much I knew. So I didn't really shed any new light on that, the most clear why. However, I added, as I investigated and as I asked questions and as I wrote about my parents and grandparents and myself, it just added new layers of the depths of the why, I would say,
right.
Of what, my mom and dad met in 1966 in New York City. My dad lived in Harlem at the time. My mom was a social worker, and they met by chance and also fell in love, which at the time was a unusual thing for a black boy and white girl to fall in love across the great divide separating black from white in the 1960s.
Right.
This was also something that wasn't seen as fitting by neither my dad's family nor my mom's family. They had a lot of objections to it, and in fact my grandmother didn't even come to my parents' wedding because of it. So I don't think it didn't change. I knew the why. I just got a more in-depth view and understanding of kind of how that why felt for them.
Yeah, the context of it.
Spending time writing A Drop of Midnight really made me get closer to and more acquainted with the poverty that my paternal ancestry, my family on my dad's side had experienced for pretty much ever since they set foot on put on American shores. And up until my father also being born in Harlem, to working but poor parents and not being able to afford university education, not having a support system from home, and then me being born in Sweden, it shed light on the privilege that I was born into. So it opened up an avenue of gratitude that they actually did make that courageous and unusual choice to leave New York in 1969 for this unknown small university town in Sweden.
That's amazing. There's an interesting historic aspect to your mother's story. I think Elaine was born and raised in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, and that's where Joe Biden is from. I was trying to do the chronology, and I thought maybe did her parents know the Bidens, or did she know the Bidens and play
I asked her
with the future president? I
asked her about that. They went to the same high school. Now, my mom has a few years, so my mom must have been a junior when he was a freshman. But she said she didn't know him.
Interesting.
I don't know if that had to do with that as a junior it wasn't cool to hang out with freshmen, or she just didn't know he'd be the candidate for that he'd be vice president one day, because she might have made an attempt,
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, no, it's interesting, up until a few years ago, every time I tell even Americans, I mean, obviously people outside of America had no idea of where Scranton was, but even talking to Americans, they'd be like, Scranton, Pennsylvania? No, never heard of it.
Yeah.
It's really small town USA. Then after the American iteration of The Office takes place in Scranton, all of a sudden people knew about Scranton, and then Joe Biden became VP, and then everybody knew about. So that Joe Biden put Scranton on the map.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Now the book is more about your father's side of the family than your mother's. So there's some reference of the really rich cultural, all different parts of the world that your mother's family flows from. But are you kind of saving her story for another book, or why did it end up more about your dad than your mother?
Because the deciding factor, Len, in my identity crises was the fact that my skin color was other than white.
Right.
That was the way I saw it as a 7, 8, 9-year-old child, and then moving on into my teenage years and even adulthood. What set me aside from the norm in Sweden at the time, where when I started school in first grade, I was one of only 3 kids with brown skin in the entire school, and that was the case for the first 6 years. Now, that made a deep impression on me, and kind of that feeling seeped into me at an early age and has stayed with me for a long time. So obviously for me, that was the first point of entry to kind of unravel and lay bare my roots and kind of map out my identity, was looking at my dad's side. But I really wish I had room in the book to include a little more of my mother's heritage, because it's also very interesting, and it also entails migration and kind of class travel and so forth. But yeah, that will have to be for another book.
Right. One of my favorite characters in reading it is your father's mother, your grandmother, Madame. Is that how she insisted on being called?
Exactly.
What can you say about her? She's quite a figure.
She is. What I thought was interesting is the kind of diametrically opposed survival strategies that my grandfather Solomon and my grandmother, Lillian, and then formerly known as Adadye, but by all called Madame, they both lived in Harlem. My grandfather was a lot older than my grandmother when they met, but she early on adhered to and was attracted to the Pan-African message and the belief that black people in America should move back to Africa. Whereas my grandfather, on the other hand, had been born in South Carolina, in Allendale. His entire family were sharecroppers. And more or less him being born, he was destined to live that life also, but managed to get out and to break out of Allendale and migrate north to Harlem, where he eventually landed a job as a waiter. And to him, he had already achieved success that was way beyond anybody in his family that he had left behind. So to him, any talk of going back to Africa or protesting in the streets or picketing and walking around with signs and was just craziness. His recipe for survival was mind your own business, put food on the table, dress respectably, look sharp, and that's the way you'll survive. That's the way your family will survive. Whereas my grandmother was a revolutionary. She was very attracted to early kind of calls for rights for African Americans and for black people. Where even in the 40s, where my grandfather was, as was the custom, as all African American men did at the time, put lye in his hair to straighten it, to conk it, as they called it. She wore her hair natural, which was quite unusual at the time, and my grandfather thought that it wasn't just unusual; it was crazy.
That must have been a heck of a hot romance to bring two people together that came from such different perspectives on reality.
Undoubtedly, and I just find it still intriguing and interesting that they had these so diametrically different ideas of how to survive as a black person in America at the time. And yet, and still, they both did. They died within 2 weeks of each other in 1983.
Wow!
So they survived up until, not an extreme old age, but well past what would be retirement.
Yeah. What a story.
Yeah.
Well, another thing that. You don't talk that much about your own music. You certainly mentioned the importance of hip-hop and just the sense of your identity forming around it. But there's, to my reading of it, intriguing history from slave songs to blues to jazz to hip-hop, and just kind of a progression of essential American music coming out of the black experience. And I've sort of heard people reference that, but in your writing of it, it seemed particularly vivid. And then, you're carrying, in some ways, your own music carries that, hip-hop into the Swedish language. I mean, that's kind of an amazing extension of it. But I wonder if in your own, having grown up with it and understood the history of it through this book, Is there any way to see what the next phase of music in that lineage might be? That's blues and jazz are very different, and jazz and hip hop are very different. Is there something coming that's technical, or the next thing that will have as much of its own place in the evolution of music as hip hop has compared with jazz?
I wonder. I mean, when you look at it from blues to jazz to rhythm and blues and then on to hip hop, they're different, but they're also connected and kind of, blues being the foundation, which then jazz was a development and a totally a branch from that tree, and then it's just branched off. And I kind of see hip hop as attached to that same root that is that is blues way back at the turn of the last century. Now, what's coming next? That's a very good question. I would love to know that. But today also the how global and how much smaller the world has become because of the internet and because of people being able to travel long distances with an ease that earlier generations have not been able to. And also hip-hop culture, just like blues and just like jazz, but hip-hop even more so, has just become not only African-American music, not only American music, but music of the people of the world. I've met rappers from Peru to China to Zambia to, Italy, Spain. Hip-hop is a franchise. As a franchise culture, emanating from the South Bronx and becoming truly global pop culture. There is literally, I would say, very few people in Sweden today that haven't heard a hip-hop song.
Is most of your music that you do in hip-hop in Sweden, is it in the Swedish language? Do you do anything in English? Or?
Yes. I do a bit in English, but most of it has been in Swedish for the past 20 years, I would say. Prior to that, during the 90s, it was all in English. But in the book, I make this jump, so I don't really cover anything between the ages of 14. When I start writing the book in 2015, I've just turned 40, and I kind of look back to my childhood up until the age of 14 when I discovered hip-hop. So you're right about that, Len. There is a gap between the ages 14 and 40, and that is definitely something that I plan to write more about in coming books, hopefully, or a book at least.
When it's clear you've had a huge impact in Sweden with your music, the Swedish Grammys, but there's like 10 million people in Sweden, and are there many Swedish speakers elsewhere in the world? Is your music confined to people who can understand what you're saying when you're singing in Swedish?
Our neighboring, our Scandinavian and Nordic neighbors understand Swedish to a point. So my primary areas of work are Sweden and Norway, sometimes Denmark, and the occasional foray into Finland.
I see.
But otherwise, pretty limited to a small corner of the world.
Making a big impact in it.
Yeah. I mean, hip-hop, I started listening to hip-hop about 89 and also started writing my own songs that same year and have been doing so ever since. So I was not the first absolutely not the first hip-hop artist in Sweden, but definitely one of the earlier ones. I've had the great fortune to having discovered hip-hop at the time that I did, be one of the artists to help establish it as and build hip-hop up to what it is today in Sweden, which is definitely the most popular form of music on the charts, on TV, at the festivals, with a ton of artists, all performing in the Swedish language. And that's what's so interesting, and it's one of the things I want to tell the American audience, or report back to the American audience, I should say, is just to understand the depth of the impact that American culture has abroad, and specifically African American music has had. I mean, jazz obviously was also global pop culture, but several decades earlier, and today it's hip hop. And I truly think that that's an amazing thing, being that it is a form of music born in a borough of a city in the United States, and now is truly something that people all over the world identify with.
You know, when I saw that in the book, and you write about it, the coronavirus, the spread of it, it starts in Wuhan, China, and then in a series of months, it's all over the world to where it affects all of us now. And have you ever thought, how does something like hip hop spread? I mean, we talk about things going viral on the internet and things like that, but there's something ready in lots of different cultures to be changed and inspired by this music that came out of a specific place, as you say, in Brooklyn. And there's sort of a readiness, and kind of when the world is ready, the virus will spread, or the cultural vibration will spread. Do you see any connections in that, given that we're all living in the age of coronavirus?
I don't know if the analogy to the coronavirus. I mean, hip hop in its global, when it started making headway globally after several years of gestating in New York and other places in the United States, was really the pre-internet analog way, by records and tapes actually physically making their way over here, magazines, and then after a while TV shows, and we'd get cassette tapes of recorded radio shows from New York City radio. When I would visit New York in the summers, visiting my family as a teenager, I'd bring cassette tapes of recorded New York radio playing hip-hop music back to Sweden. Those would be distributed throughout my network of friends in Lund. So it was really a pre-global, pre-internet, pre-digital age way of spreading. I just think that hip-hop culture attracted young people, as it still does, and also people who in any way who are a minority or feel oppressed or powerless in society. Right. And it's a very efficient DIY megaphone that's not only, and that's the genius of hip-hop, that is not only a great platform for kind of speaking on social issues, but also one for people to get release and solace and to, have fun, dance, and the fact that hip hop also is based on sampling older music. When hip hop was born, it was all sampling old soul and funk records, but also jazz and then blues. And today, and for many years we've sampled, everything from classical music to prog music to anything can be sampled and made into hip hop, which makes it very kind of flexible and very easy to kind of utilize and make it your own, if you understand. And I think that has really helped it to gain root in all across the globe as it has today.
Yeah, I was able to mutate in different environments and find success by being so flexible.
Being way more benign.
Of course, it's like, this is a creepy thing to say. I told my wife, I said, I'm hoping for the next half an hour to not say one racist thing. So I think, you compared hip hop to coronavirus. Good work, old man.
No, that's all right, Len. That's all right. You haven't crossed any lines.
Okay, that's good. Well, then I'll keep going. Having
said that, I mean, it really speaks to the coronavirus really speaks to how fast the pathogen can spread, but also how fast information spreads today. Because we have two things going on today. It's not only the virus, but it's the fear of the virus and its economic implications from that fear. And it's astounding to see how that is working and seeping into every facet of human life today.
Yeah, it's amazing.
From us about 2 months ago, not ever having heard of it.
And like in the last 4 days, it just seems like the world has changed.
Yeah.
So. Well,
it has changed.
But for the coronavirus, in 12 days, on March 30th, you were going to have a pretty wonderful event in Harlem. Tell about that and what the plans are for the rescheduling of it.
I spent a good part of 2 years writing the book, and upon completing it, felt an urgent need to get back on stage where I've lived most of my life. Having discovered hip-hop at the age of 14, it became not only something that I thought was a lot of fun to spend time doing and learning, but also something that became a part of my identity. I think because of how those rappers of the late 80s and early 90s spoke to me, and that also having brown and black skin, I identified so totally with that music. So having spent 2 years kind of away from it made me really want to get back on stage. So I decided to turn the story of the book, a compacted version of the story in the book, into a stage performance and write new music for it. So I basically get on stage and for 90 minutes tell the story about my own identity crises and how that led me to search for my roots and what I found and how that changed me. And I tell the story and segue into song and into rap sometimes, and then back into storytelling and spoken word. And it covers music from about when my grandfather was born up until today. So from blues and jazz up until hip hop.
Now, and was this a show that you were performing in Sweden, and it would have been English, or it would have been like a Swedish version of it?
I performed it. It opened, so the book was released in Sweden in November 2016. The show opened September 2017 and was done in Swedish.
I see.
Of course, with a lot of English. Some of the songs were in English. And in the Swedish version of A Drop of Midnight, a lot of what my father, mother, and my father's friends are saying is left in English, because they, of course, all speak English. And my first language, even though I was born in Sweden, was English, and I'd speak Swedish outside of my parents' homes. So I decided it was very hard to translate the feeling of when somebody like my dad's friend Don Franklin speaks, you know, his way of saying all right or saying yeah or saying boy into Swedish. But Swedes are very fluent in English, so that was fine. Now, translating it back to English, of course, everything is in English except a few words here and there that are left in Swedish, just to give the reader a bit of Swedish flavor, which was important to me. Yeah. To really place this story in something that is not the United States, quite different, actually.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the interplay in the languages is fascinating to me when it comes to the book, because am I right that you wrote the book originally in Swedish?
Yes.
And then how did you get hooked up with a translator through Amazon Crossing? What was the connection there?
So the book has been translated by Rachel Wilson Broyles. She's an American, but speaks Swedish and has translated a lot of Swedish books into English. And I was put in contact with her through the Swedish consulate, actually, in New York City. And she started the work of translating the book prior to us actually having a publishing deal. And then upon completion, Amazon Crossing showed their interest. And from then on, we've been on track to release.
Yeah. And have you been pleased with the publicity and just the kind of the marketing presence of Amazon Crossing? It was truncated because of the virus, but how was it going before the changes happened?
It was going splendidly, and for me, this is just such a wild ride to see this book be able to travel back across the Atlantic. Of course, my family's story is such a transatlantic one, from my ancestors, the slaves, being taken from Africa, transported across the Atlantic, to my dad migrating from Harlem to Sweden, and me then migrating with this story back across the Atlantic. So I've just felt just this immense gratitude of being able to bring the story, in a sense, back to one of my ancestral homes, being New York in the United States. And everything was going really well up until Corona kind of threw a monkey wrench in everyone's plans. But I hope I hope to breathe new life and maintain momentum throughout this storm that we're all experiencing now.
Yeah.
So that once this blows over, which it will, and the world will have changed, I have a new date for my stage performance. It's opening in Harlem on the 13th of October.
Good.
And I just hope to be able to, that we can all resume and be better for it afterwards. That's truly what I hope for humankind and for the world, that this can change us in a positive direction and not accelerate the toxicity already going on in pretty much every society around the world.
Yeah, well said. I think you sort of hint in the book that your own, you talk about sort of your returning to the U.S., that is that kind of a result of your involvement with the book, or just the rhythm of your life? You can imagine leaving Sweden and coming back to the U.S.?
I'll be honest with you, Len. Ever since I was a kid, I dreamt of, my dream was to move back to the United States. I couldn't for the life of me, as a 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, up into my teens, understand why my parents ever would want to move to a backwater country like Sweden. My father's arguments of free education and free healthcare didn't mean a thing to me at that time. Now, of course, as an adult, I can see his reasons and their reasons, but yet and still, I've harbored that dream ever since. Writing the book, as I started writing the book, and in the opening months of writing, I started realizing that I not only wanted to go to South Carolina, but I had to go to South Carolina to be able to write the book. I traveled there in September. I started writing the book in January 2015. In September 2015, I traveled to Allendale, where my grandfather was born in 1907. Upon coming back to New York City, which was my base while in the States, and spending time at my friend Marcus Samuelson's house, where I actually wrote large portions of the book, I met a Swedish woman who was working at the UN at the time, and we fell in love. And so I ended up actually living in New York for 3 years, before which, when it was time for us to have a child, we decided to move back to Sweden, where we are now. But I hope to be back stateside as soon as possible.
Well, that's an amazing geographical trek that your family has been on, and now you're the latest one to be pushing it back across the Atlantic.
Kind of wanting to migrate back, which is something my father was always. I mean, I started playing around with and getting interested in hip hop at the age of 14. He just, I think, took that as something I was doing as a hobby or something for recreation. He always told me that I was supposed to be a lawyer, and that was his dream for me, and that I had been born in this country with free education, something that he couldn't take for granted, but I could. And when I dropped out of college at the age of 20 and told him that I wanted to be a rapper, I think it just blew his mind in a bad way. He couldn't for the life. I mean, it must have been, just mind-bending for him that, here he had gone through all this to kind of put me in this position where I'd be born into this privilege, and all I wanted to do was to kind of emulate and imitate and that same street culture from that he escaped from.
Well, there's some candid and I found very moving parts of the book in the early going where he's talking about, why are you doing this? Why are you going to write a book about this? And he sounds like he's a pretty effective person when he's arguing a point. But I guess, has he read the book, and what does he think of your project now that it's completed?
he was not pleased, I'll tell you. And a lot of that's one of the meta-narratives in the book, is trying to get him to tell me the stories, because the more he finds out and realizes that I'm actually writing a book, he closes up and doesn't want to tell me stories about the family, because he doesn't want, as he puts it, he doesn't want me to put his business in the streets. And he feels that this is private, these are family matters, and I don't want strangers and people we don't know to read about what our family has been through. His exact words to me were why don't you write a crime novel instead, something that people actually want to read, you know? You know, something that people will pay money for. Nobody's going to pay money for a book about, you know, poor people and enslaved people that didn't know any better. You know, spend your time on something positive instead. And that was a source of conflict between he and I that also is reflected in the book, is my kind of hurt feelings with me feeling like he doesn't understand why it's important for me to root out and unearth my roots, and the complexity of having a black parent and a white parent, and maneuvering in a world where I've so often neither felt black enough to be black or white enough to be white. And when it comes to that, it's hard for us to see eye to eye. So he has read the book, he claims, 3 times. His Swedish isn't great, I'll tell you. He has not, I haven't given him a copy of the English book yet, but when he does, I'm sure he'll take a long sigh, and he'll, you know, and again reel from the fact that he has such a stubborn son who just doesn't listen to him, you know.
Well, what about the readers, the commercial success of it at this point? And I have a feeling that the English version is going to be very successful. At some point, does that change his mind and prove that, well, in fact, this is a book a lot of people want to read?
I think it does, to a point. I mean, he would call me after the book had been released in Sweden, each time he met someone on the street who congratulated him on the fact that his son had written such a good book. That made him happy. But at the same time, and I understand him more now than when I was writing the book, because when I was writing the book, I was really pushing to complete it, and for him to understand me. I must be honest and say I didn't lend him the same level of understanding that I demanded and hoped that he would give me. And that is something that I've come to understand now, that everybody has a story to tell. Not everybody wants to tell it, but the fact of having somebody else hold the pen and tell your story can be very, very scary. And there are passages in the book where, for example, my father is at the hospital and I'm afraid that he's actually dying. You know, he was in critical condition, and 3 times during the course of writing the book, we all thought he was going to pass. And there's a passage in the book where I write about us being in the hospital, and he couldn't go to the bathroom on his own, and I had to help him go to the bathroom. And it's pretty graphically described. It was such a painful moment, one of the most painful moments in my life. I couldn't not write about it. At the same time, I understand the vulnerability that Dad must have felt having somebody else, even though it's his son, write about it and put that out for people in his community and in his town to read about him being in such a vulnerable position. And it speaks to the kind of ethical dilemma of, well, my story is something I see as something that is my right to tell, but my story also touches on other people's stories and is intertwined with them. And then who has the right to tell it? You know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I would say, I would offer one stranger reading of it to say that I think your portrait of him is characterized by a sense of his dignity, that he appears to someone that doesn't know the family as a man of immense character and principles, and that in some ways your honesty about that setting just underlined that. I think the image of him.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think, but I can see that. Gosh, what a tricky thing to navigate for sure.
Yeah. But thank you so much for saying that, Len, and I'll pass that on to him, because that kind of feedback means a lot to him. I told him at the end of the day, this work is born of love, and to try and understand the love between my mom and dad, and why they made the choices they did, even though I for so many years felt like it was so complicated for me to navigate that in-betweenness that I call it, neither being American, Swedish, black, or white. And that it really is a work of love and an ode to all the sacrifice that my mother and father, my grandparents, and my ancestors before them went through in order for me to be where I am. And at the end of the day, I think he sees that too, and I think he's found some peace with it. But there definitely were a lot of conflicts along the way.
I can only imagine. My father is alive, and he's 93, and he's a Trump supporter, and I'm not. And fathers and sons are always at it. And
we can get into it, right?
And when you do it with love, I think everybody gets a little larger if you can contain it and not just go running out of the room screaming.
Well, my hat's off to him that he's still hanging in there and still has an opinion about the world, even though it's not an opinion that you or I have. But I realize that too, as I write in the book. My uncle Obi, who lives in Baltimore, he's also a Trump supporter. Works as a volunteer for the campaign, both in the past election and in this coming one. And of course, that to me is just perplexing and interesting and terrifying at the same time. But I love my uncle, and I speak to him. I try not to get into debates about it, just because I love him, and I know he has 4 kids that are all Democrats, so they probably give him a hard time enough.
He's grateful for a nephew that will even listen to him with curiosity, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, so Len, I understand your dilemma there with your dad, and all I try to do today is keep the conflicts with my father to a minimum, and just remember that he can say some outlandish stuff or say things I don't agree with, but I try not to get into arguments with him about it.
Yeah, that's good advice. Great. I have been speaking with Jason Timbuktu Diakité, and I'm going to start.
You got it.
Yeah, but I stopped. I would do this. Wait a minute, try it again.
But you nailed it, Len. You nailed it.
I nailed it. Yeah, but then it was like I didn't have a net. I didn't know where to go. Let me try it again. I've been speaking with Jason Timbuktu Diakité, author of A Drop of Midnight, a memoir released in English translation this month by Amazon Crossing. Thanks very much, Jason.
Thank you so much for having me, Len.
That's it for this week's show. I'm not sure who I'll be talking to next week. I have a line into Amazon to see if I can talk with someone for an update on how coronavirus is affecting Amazon's operations, everything from what's available for purchase to deliveries. Darlene and I have got different views on when is it safe to pick up an Amazon package that gets delivered to us here in Maine, and we're compromising, we're just doing it her way, which is to let it sit there for 5 or 6 hours before we touch it. But I'd like to find out what's a safe way to handle incoming packages. We're doing a very strict quarantine here in Maine. I'm 69. I've had kind of lung infection issues all my life, so we're just following the rules pretty carefully here, and obviously in a very fortunate circumstance to be here at the beach in off season. Although by the looks of it, this may extend well into the summer, but we're just taking it a day at a time. I'm providing updates on our experience here on my morning journal, which you can find in flash briefing for Alexa. You just go Alexa, enable morning journal, and then if you say what's new, my daily posts, which I put up each morning, will arrive with anything else that you've got for flash briefings, other news shows, or whatever it might be. And I really look forward to putting them up every day. I've done a couple out on the beach, but it's been cold lately. Thanks for listening. I hope you're doing well. And it's when I speak to the audience here, I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I was sure that every one of you listening is experiencing in some way this coronavirus outbreak, epic, pandemic, whatever you want to call it. It just affects all of us, and that's a remarkable thing, and maybe there's some benefits to that Jason kind of suggested. I really enjoyed talking with him, and I highly recommend the book. It's very well written, and it's a gripping story. It's almost like a detective story as he's exploring his family history in America. And I think, I hope there's more writing that comes in book form, as well as the music that's clearly central to his life as a hip-hop star in Sweden. And when his show is rescheduled in Harlem, October, who knows, if we're around and we can move around, I might try to go to see that. I think that would be a pretty dramatic show to watch, having read the book and had a chance to talk to him. Thanks for listening. Have a good day. Bye.